Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show, Monster Mondays, each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of those shows at filmseizure.com. On this episode, I have a trio of topics to discuss with reviews of X and Morbius, as well as a note on this year's Academy Awards. So it's a packed episode, so let's dive in. First up, I am going to talk about Ty West's new horror film X that came out actually 2 weeks ago. I originally intended on doing an episode dedicated solely to the movie, but I ended up getting a little sidetracked, so I apologize for that. But X is about a group of filmmakers who are going to a remote Texas farmhouse where they plan to rent out the guest house on the property. The executive producer of this film, Wayne, played by Martin Henderson, has not explained to the farm's owners that he was coming here with 5 other people, and he has definitely not explained that they are actually making a porno film here. But with Wayne and his director of the film, RJ, played by Owen Campbell, who wants to make a more cinematic style adult film, RJ's girlfriend and boom mic operator Lorraine, and who's played by Jenna Ortega, who is in just about everything nowadays, it seems like, and the 3 stars of this film, Jackson, played by the rapper and actor Kid Cudi, bombshell blonde Bobby Lynn, played by Brittany Snow, and Wayne's girlfriend, Maxine, played by Mia Goth. Now, it's Maxine who is really meant to shine with this movie. In fact, our story begins with her looking at herself in the mirror and telling herself that she's a fucking star. She also attracts the attention of the old man farmer's wife, Pearl, who is kind of a tragic character of her own, too. Pearl is a former beauty from the 20s, and you believe that she was something on the level of Maxine, which makes a lot of sense because Mia Goth plays both the young Maxine and the older Pearl in some very clever filmmaking. Now, Pearl wants to be wanted again. She's got a bit of a sexual appetite that really launches the horror elements of this movie, and it is a very, very well-made horror film. This is a slow burn. After all, this is an A24 horror film, and they excel at making these horror and thrillers that slowly build with tension. But everything about this movie, from the way it's shot, to the way it's acted, to the way that you just get this impression that something is very, very wrong on this farm, is wonderful. Ty West knows his subject matter. He knows where to draw inspiration from and how to make a movie that is honoring those inspirations. Of course, the immediate comparison drawn to this movie is with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's hard not to see that with how the film is shot, where it's shot, but however, there are more influences from higher brow films like Psycho and even The Shining. Now, this movie lets you feel something is wrong, and it barely teases you by giving you fake scares and stuff like that. Yes, there are a few, but it never cuts the tension out completely, as most fake outs tend to in present day horror films. Even in classic horror films, usually there would be some sort of release of tension after the fake scare, but this one, no, it remains that way. But it also lets you laugh when something is funny, like the silhouette of Jackson's massive hog hanging between his thighs in one of the scenes, or let you squirm when you watch 2 very old people fuck. It's what I like to call a living movie. It allows you to basically, it allows you to react as you normally would in real life. There hasn't been a better looking horror movie or more lovingly constructed homage to horror exploitation in a long time. Maybe Ty West's own House of the Devil would be the last one to look this good and to have that deep, lovingly constructed homage. And I'd be hard-pressed to say that this is an absolutely perfect movie, but it is close. The look, the feel, the overall impression it leaves with you are all major positives for this movie. But there are a couple of things that I didn't love. I didn't like how it started and ended with a wraparound plot, or the discovery of the crime scene, really, more than anything. I also didn't like the revelation of who Maxine is in relationship to another through line in the film, but those are only really minor gripes that really does nothing to distract from the quality film that we were given. I will say that 2022 has had a good start for the indie horror scene between X and The Cursed. Both are dripping in their atmospheric look and feel, and I want more of this and a lot less of those Texas Chainsaw Massacre types that we also saw come out last month. But let's move on to this week's new release, which is a genre that I actually kind of would like more of: monster superhero comic book movies. Of course, I'm referring to Morbius, starring the ever interesting Jared Leto. But here's the thing. I really do want more of these types of movies where you can have characters like Venom or Morbius, the types who need to sulk around in the shadows and be anti-heroes because the means to their stopping bad guys is far more brutal than your average Spider-Man or what have you. I want a Tomb of Dracula movie or a Werewolf by Night movie. Hell, let's get a Living Mummy movie in here, or a whole Midnight Suns or Legion of Monsters franchise going. But all that said, Morbius is not the movie to start something like that. This is a difficult movie to really honestly review. It's not quite as overstuffed as Venom Let There Be Carnage was last year. Both Venom movies and Morbius are all kept at a tight runtime, with none of them going over the 2-hour mark. And that's actually kind of welcome. However, that did hurt the second Venom movie. I don't know if that necessarily hurts this one or not. But many comic book movies start to stretch their runtimes now to no less than 135 minutes, and in most recent cases are now starting to top out at almost 2.5 hours or more. So keeping a movie at a tight 105 minutes like Morbius is kind of a nice change of pace. And let's think about that for a minute. That pace is set because, frankly, no one really knows much about Morbius. Those of us who have read comics for a long time, and especially the Spider-Man comics, know who Michael Morbius is. He's the living vampire. But I would say not many of us readers know too much about him to really expect this nice deep dive into his history and band of characters most closely connected to him. He was just a villain of the month in an Amazing Spider-Man comic 50 years ago. So you're already dealing with a character with a very shallow well to draw from. And that could mean that you could basically expand on that character however you want. But you're also dealing with a character, like I said, that was created 50 years ago. And while he has been around in the comics for that entire time, like I said, he was just kind of originally created to menace Spider-Man in an issue in 1971. So you also have to realize that you're dealing with a premise that is from a very different time in comics and the subsequent comic book movie genre. This is where I will give this movie some major points for kind of dropping us into the schlocky waters. You see, Dr. Morbius, Jared Leto, is an accomplished biologist who specializes in hematology. And the reason for this, for his interest in this field, is due to a blood disease that he has had that has no cure. He's in constant pain and requires multiple blood transfusions in a single day. And as a young boy, he befriended a kid that he nicknamed Milo, who's played by Matt Smith in the present day. And he promised Milo that he would find a cure. The two became surrogate brothers, and thanks to Milo's deep pockets of family wealth, Morbius could fund his experiments to splice vampire bat DNA with human DNA. The way that Morbius figures it, bats who can ingest blood and prevent it from coagulating hold the secret to cure their blood disease. Sure. The premise is silly, but I'm willing to buy it. This is the kind of movie that doesn't bother you too much with science, hard or soft, so you just kind of have to accept the idea that this will work in some way. You also have to accept that when Morbius goes into the jungle to capture some of these bats to do his research on, he just simply has to slice his hand open and holds it up to the cave entrance so that these bats can simply sniff his blood, and that be enough to get an entire cave full of bats to come out to be caught and taken back to New York with him. Again, sure, whatever. It's a neat scene in the way that it looks and the way that it's presented. It's probably not very realistic, but again, we're already dealing with a guy who's going to become a vampire man. But like I said, all of this, or, like I said, this is all going to be a very silly premise, but we just stick with it, right? Now, of course, this all goes awry, and Michael Morbius becomes what's called a pseudo-vampire. He gets hungry for blood, and he has to drink the stuff every so often, or he becomes a monster. Now, Morbius's big claim to fame as he begins his arc in this movie is that he created something that's called synthetic blood that, despite being baby blue in color, works just as well as the red stuff. It is a perfect synthetic clone of blood. Now, Morbius realizes that he can drink the blue stuff and it will keep him from going all monster-like for about 6 hours. And the more that he drinks of the blue stuff to stave off his hunger, the shorter that time window becomes. So he needs to figure out a cure or a way to solve his hunger before he turns into a killer. And a killer is exactly what Matt Smith's Milo has become. Now, the movie's real meat is that you have Morbius trying to solve for his own new ailment that came about when he was trying to solve his old one. His surrogate brother is now out and about on the streets with that same injection that Morbius had. He stole it from his brother, and he has now become a monster, and he's trying to eat people. And you have police chasing these vampire killings that they believe Morbius is solely to blame for. And caught in the middle of all of this is Morbius's girlfriend, Dr. Martine Bancroft. All of that seems to be fairly standard stuff, and the premise itself, Jared Leto as Morbius and Matt Smith as Milo, are all basically things that have the pieces there to make this a somewhat engaging film. But when you get into the actual details, things get way goofy way fast. For example, the movie kind of has the same problem the Iron Man movies had. Everyone of particular interest gets or is teased to have the same powers as our hero does. And that's when you realize that the people making the movie didn't really know what to do other than to have that kind of villain being a dark reflection of the hero thing. I really only ever find that sort of stuff interesting when it's the hero themselves having to face their own dark side. Second, you have a lot of dialogue from Matt Smith talking about how he and Morbius can finally be free and be powerful and be able to embrace their new gifts and so on and so forth. And the only motivation I can see from Milo is to drive Morbius over the edge to make him into a monster like he is. And that's fine, but what then? As he does this, Milo still tries to punch and fight Morbius, even when he's begging his surrogate brother to stop being noble or whatever. So then you have those fight scenes, and the effects are pretty bad. I don't want to rip into the effects only because this movie itself kind of wants to be schlock. And I apologize for using that word so often, but there really isn't any other way to describe what happened to this movie. But you ain't seen nothing until you see Matt Smith digitally altered to look like a scary vampire monster man dancing in the mirror as he is getting dressed to go out on the town. It looks odd and off and not very good. I found myself chuckling at times when Smith would be embracing his newfound power and dancing around and just hamming it up. And I think I was laughing for the right reasons because I'm pretty sure Smith is just having the time of his life being this over-the-top comic book villain. There are a couple of mid-credit scenes that I think Sony is using to maybe, I don't know, build the next thing, and neither scene is very good at all. Both are overly short, and one is so bad that I'm pretty sure it was added just in like the last couple of months, and they didn't have full access to both actors who were supposedly in the scene. It's a blatantly bad scene that I couldn't believe someone okayed it to make it to the final cut of the movie. But there's a huge plot hole in this movie. So yeah, Morbius turns into a vampire and kills 8 hired hands on this container ship in international waters. We see that in the trailer. Great. It's probably the neatest of all the action scenes in the movie. I also like that the ship is called the Murnau in honor of F.W. Murnau, who made the original version of Nosferatu. That's a nice touch. But anyway, he decides that he simply cannot go to that dark place again, right? Well, that makes sense. He realizes that when he gets the hunger, he can drink the artificial blood to stave that off, right? Okay, well, Milo has decided to only drink the red stuff, the real blood, and he's basically a rampaging monster. Now, throughout the entire movie, Morbius is trying to either A, find a solve for why the artificial blood is slowly losing its potency to stave off the hunger, or B, come up with a way to kill both Milo and himself if plan A fails. But why can't Milo and Morbius just drink blood from donors and blood banks? Why does it have to be the fake stuff? It's never explained. If Morbius has a worry that it will turn him into a monster if he drinks the real stuff just once, well, that's too late because he drank 8 guys worth of that stuff the first time he vamped out, and he's still a good guy when he can control the hunger. I feel like no one really thought that through, or the explanation for all of that was just simply cut out of the movie. And speaking of cut out of the movie, there are several things in the trailer that are either changed or completely left out of the movie. It's possible this movie was anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes longer. I don't think that extra stuff would have necessarily saved this movie, but it would have at least maybe solved for that plot hole that I discovered, like, immediately. Now, Morbius feels like a movie made 20 years ago when the superhero genre of the early 21st century was born. It's got a cheap quality to it that feels quaint. It cheaps out on the effects. It cheaps out on the story to try to bring this doctor from a thinking guy to a punching vampire man as quickly as possible. The action scenes are also very hard to see what happens. It's a lot of that close-up fighting as bodies just fly through a space from one side of the screen to the other, and you just have to wait for the next calm frame to figure out what happened. Sometimes it uses slow motion in the middle of a big comic book move, almost like a splash page, by one of the characters during a fight. But that clearly had to be done on reserve because they probably didn't have the budget to do too many effects like that. I actually didn't find it boring, but it's not very good. But also, it's not very good in a kind of silly, no harm, no foul sort of way, too. I'm not sorry I saw this. Like I said, I like Jared Leto as Morbius. There are nuggets of things here to like. It's just that it falls into a lot of traps bad movies do. And I found myself in the first 2 acts kind of smiling at the idea that this was what it was like seeing a superhero movie 20 years ago. But that faded pretty quickly because I also realized that was a completely different time for the young genre. It's evolved now and became something else since. And that really hurts Morbius in the long run. So yes, I totally recommend X, but I can't say I really recommend Morbius outside of a rainy day rental. You probably won't bemoan the money spent on that rental, but you're likely not going to love the movie as a whole. So now, before we close things down, I wanted to give a recap of the Academy Awards. You know, the thing that just happened last weekend. I can't imagine anything happening during that broadcast that would have ended up creating an overflow of memes in the zeitgeist or anything. But I'm not actually going to talk about that. So, Hollywood celebrated itself for the 94th time on Sunday. Coda turned out to be the big winner, having won Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor for Troy Kotsur, who might have had the best and sweetest moment of the whole night, and for Best Adapted Screenplay. And if I'm being honest, I really did not expect Coda to take home the top prize. I figured it would have either been The Power of the Dog, which only won one Oscar, Best Director, or Belfast, which only won one Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. I was also mostly ignorant of Coda thanks to it being an exclusive to Apple Plus and didn't play at theaters or at least during parts of the day in which I could have actually gone to a theater and seen it. Now, the issue with exclusiveness is a topic for another time, but I digress. Congratulations to Coda. However, there are larger issues with the Academy Awards, and it's almost impossible to know how to quote-unquote fix them. On one hand, there's an issue that the Oscars can never fix, the fact that there are a large number of people who never did or never will care for them. There are several people, about 95% of all your Facebook and Twitter feed, if my math is correct, that will probably state multiple times or and certainly very publicly, that they don't care about the Oscars and don't even want to talk about them, except for to express their opinion multiple times over, and don't want to hear how much about how you watched them or reacted to them. And they'll tell you this many times over, despite saying and claiming that they don't care and they don't want to talk about it. Now, there are people who just don't care about award stuff. And I can understand that. I don't exactly care about the Emmys. My taste in music is almost never represented in major categories of the Grammys. I don't go to plays, so the Tonys are right out. But the Oscars, well, sometimes I look at them as what James Rolfe, also known as the Angry Video Game Nerd, called them in a recent video, a list of movie suggestions. While I certainly see a lot of movies, I don't know much about higher brow movies or higher brow filmmakers. I know about stuff that's made in the past, but not necessarily stuff made more recently. So I sometimes see something like a Coda, and I get curious about it and will eventually want to see it. I'm also not the type of person who necessarily rails against the personalities of the various nominees and the people in attendance. I saw a tweet from Red Letter Media's Jay Bauman, who called the room of collected filmmakers narcissists and sociopaths. So I guess it's true what they say, that if you can't make movies, you just criticize them. And they have a pretty significant history of criticizing the actual people, quite a bit on the YouTube channel, but whatever. I can have a healthy separation of the artist from their art. But their bigger problems that often come out surround three main things: the ratings, the content of the show, and the length of the show. And if we were to look at the content and the length, those are pretty closely related to one another. The content is why the show goes so long. We live in a time in which fewer and fewer people care about what the celebrities have to say. You either are all the way in that there are evils in the world that must be taken care of, and you're into these people using their platform to do something about it, or you're very averse to hearing what they have to say about whatever hot topic there is to talk about. Sometimes acceptance speeches involving these topics send the show over its supposed tight 3-hour runtime. Sometimes the hosts themselves are the cause for it to go overtime, which is more of the problem with this year's show in particular. And I could get into the whole topic of how they trimmed some awards out so that they could very quickly just kind of recap who won in these categories. That was all meant to make this a tighter show, but unfortunately the host ended up spinning their wheels on a lot of their jokes and a lot of the overly written content, and suddenly things went over time again. But a lot of people don't really tune in to watch the music performances either, like they might for the Grammys or even the MTV Video Music Awards. Hell, the MTV Movie Awards have performances that have nothing to do with movies. So those aren't going to draw people in. They aren't going to show up to watch the 3-minute clip celebrating 60 years of James Bond. They aren't tuning in to what Francis Ford Coppola is going to say about The Godfather celebrating 50 years. Sure, there are some who might want to see what the celebrities, particularly the women, are wearing, but those people might turn off the show when the awards actually begin. But the one thing that people care most about are the movies that they will actually go and see. The nominees included several box office failures. Of course, the reason for why many of them failed came down to two reasons: exclusive streaming rights, so people would not have to go to the theater, and the ongoing COVID pandemic. If the pandemic wasn't a thing, I suspect many or all of these movies would have been quite successful. However, there used to be a long-standing tradition that at least one of the big box office champs would get a handful of nominations, and in particular, a Best Picture nomination. Jaws, Star Wars, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, Avatar, and Black Panther were among those nominated for film's top prize. Want to know what the top grossing movie was in 1971? It was Fiddler on the Roof, a Best Picture nominee. Sometimes those big box office movies won Best Picture: Forrest Gump, Lord of the Rings, Titanic, Rocky, The Godfather, and Silence of the Lambs. This was what was called the populist nominee. Sometimes it was rewarded for the cultural impact. Again, I'm looking at Jaws, Star Wars, and Black Panther. Sometimes it was rewarded because the movies were good and needed to be honored. Now, leading into this year's nomination ceremony, there were questions about whether or not Spider-Man No Way Home or No Time to Die would possibly nab a populist nomination for Best Picture. People laughed at this and thought it would have some sort of negative connotation to the Oscars for Spider-Man to get the nomination, or that it was a dumb complaint to make that it didn't get the nomination. And those people obviously didn't know the populist nomination rule of thumb. Why would you nominate the third Spider-Man movie in a series and the 8th overall film starring the character? Why would you nominate the slightly mixed review 25th James Bond movie? Well, both of these movies scored big at the box office and showed a sign of a return to normalcy during this pandemic. Bond was one of the very first big movies to truly return to wide release when it came out in October. Spider-Man became the largest grossing movie of 2021, basically in the final 2 weeks of the year. There's a cultural reason why you might want to nominate films like these. Granted, simply giving Spider-Man one of the 10 spots in the Best Picture category would not have brought millions of more eyes onto the broadcast or make many more people care more, but it would give fans of popular movies a little more feeling of being justified for their love of a popular movie. When Black Panther scored its Best Picture nomination, that was a major good feeling felt by a lot of people, both from all spectrums, not just black folks or white folks or brown folks. A lot of people liked that movie and they felt good about it being nominated. When Heath Ledger was nominated for playing the Joker, people wanted to see him win, especially because he died before the film came out. There is not an easy fix for these types of problems. It's hard for people to care about something that isn't exactly rewarding things that they like. It's not easy to introduce more inclusion without it feeling a little forced in many people's minds. People who are already not so sure what makes the Academy Award-winning Best Picture of the year truly worthy of that honor aren't so sure how they feel about things that they can't possibly know about. A large number of hearing people may not be interested in CODA. A large group of white folks in the middle of America maybe don't know what it's like growing up bisexual and black. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't know what it's like. And if someone feels like awards are going to go to things that they don't understand, or worse, don't want to understand, they aren't going to watch or care. So what's the fix for that? I really don't know. But the Oscars have a problem with the public that goes from what movies get nominated to who hosts to the politics that the celebrities might push to the length of time it could run. None of those things are going to magically solve themselves because the Oscars are self-nominating awards and honestly a self-congratulatory marketing tool. However, It's easier to understand why people don't care as much about the Oscars as they might have decades ago, when people generally recognized the cream of the crop of the media before the age of pop culture that rolled in during the 80s and beyond changed how movies were made, how they were conceived, and how they were marketed to people. And what's more is that any and every form of art will hit people differently. There are already conversations likely being made about what movies should have won instead of Coda. There have been conversations for decades about what makes one movie that wins an award better than a movie that made all the money at the box office. It fosters this idea that when something gets good reviews or gets awards, it is somehow damaged in terms of the reputation of that thing in other people's perspective. So as it is, it's a form of art that is subjective, like all other things that touch people in particular ways, or movies, moves them or makes them laugh or speaks to their experience or what have you. It's possible to love movies and not care about the Oscars, just as it's possible for you to care about the Oscars and who wins or doesn't win, and not like the ceremony itself. It's possible to like movies that the actors or directors make and not like those actors or directors for things that they preach or how they react to people or how they hold themselves in higher esteem than others. All of these things are possible. In fact, it's kind of the magic of movies as well as the magic of your own perspective on the world. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. And you can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. And I'll be back in May with a look at the new Marvel Studios release, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.